Next from Springfield, Representative Ann Williams, who herself was adopted shortly after birth, discusses how other states are now providing adoptees with their adoption case file information, and how she'd like to see Illinois do the same. This runs about 10 minutes.
State Representative Ann Williams, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. And by the way, this is your first appearance with us, so thanks again. What year were you elected to the legislature?
I was elected in 2010 and sworn in January of 2011.
And you represent an area up in the Chicagoland area, not too far from Wrigley Field, I guess.
Just west of Wrigley, I represent the 11th District, which includes several Chicago neighborhoods on the north side.
Now, one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about, because everyone in the legislature has their own history and uniqueness, and yours is that you were an adopted or are an adopted person, but that brings some complications that many of us who were not adopted don't appreciate. Tell us what some of the issues are, and a piece of legislation that is actually moving through the Pennsylvania legislature that you've been following. Tell us the issue and why you're following that legislation.
Sure. Many people are not aware that in most states, adoptees are unable to get their original birth certificates. Up until 2010, Illinois was one of those states. 2010, Representative Sarah Feigenholtz and a coalition of members from both sides of the aisle pushed for a bill to provide that Illinois adoptees could obtain copies of their original birth certificates. I worked on the bill as an adoptee. I was very excited about its passage. I attended the bill signing, but because I was actually born in Pennsylvania, I was unable to get my original birth certificate. Pennsylvania is one of the states that still does not allow adoptees to have access to their original birth certificates.
And what kind of complications when people can't get their original birth certificate does that present for you?
Well, it's interesting. I do have what is called a birth certificate, but it's more accurately described as an adoption certificate. It has the names of my parents, wonderful people who adopted me at birth, but what it doesn't have is what really happened when I was born. It doesn't have the name of my biological mother, my biological father. It doesn't have the name of where I was born. As I'm talking to you today, I don't know any of the circumstances surrounding my birth. I don't know what my name was at birth. I don't know what my biological mother's name was, my biological father. I know none of the circumstances. Don't even know the city in which I was born.
That was going to be what I was going to ask, if you even knew the city.
I do not.
And so now in the actual Pennsylvania legislature, there is an effort that would do what?
It was really exciting when I found out that there was a bill pending in Pennsylvania that would provide for adoptees like myself to have access to their original birth certificates. I immediately reached out to the sponsor of the legislation, offered my help in whatever way I could. He was kind enough to invite me to come to Pennsylvania, share my story with the members of the Pennsylvania committee. The bill basically would just provide that adoptees like myself could get that piece of paper that we've really wanted for really our whole lives. It just really tells the beginning of our stories and the truth of how we started in this world.
And I guess for some people, depending upon their health history, it would be very pertinent to know who their birth parents were and what the medical background is, maybe of a bone transplant or a marrow transplant or something.
Well, that's a really good point. The interesting thing about adoptees is that currently when people are adopted, there's a lot of information provided in terms of medical history. But when I was born, 1968, it was a different time, and the laws that exist today with regard to adoptee information are not that much different than those that were in existence in 1968. So even though society has changed in terms of access to information, regardless of whether you're adopted or not, the laws have not kept up with that. So people like me, not only do I not know the most basic information about my medical history, I have no sense of my ethnic background, and I don't know, the beginning of my story. So the reason that we're pushing for this bill is we really strongly believe, and I strongly believe, that every person has a basic right to understand who they are and where they came from. And having that piece of paper is critically important to those of us that are adopted, just so we understand the beginning of our stories.
Yeah, I guess you don't even know if you have any siblings.
I know nothing. And now, granted, the document that we're seeking to find is the original birth certificate. So it's a limited amount of information. It will probably have the biological mother's name on it, may or may not have the biological father. We'll have the birth date. My birthday, as I celebrate it, is in April. I'm not 100% sure if that's my actual birth date. So having that piece of paper is very important, I think, to your sense of identity, but it's also just kind of, I'm curious to know what really happened to me and how I started out.
When the law was passed here in Illinois giving people that, what ramifications were there? What were positive? Were there any negatives? I don't know if there's a community of adoptees that you've heard from relative to your interest on the bill?
It's been incredibly interesting to see it proceed. There's a myth out there that somehow birth mothers would not want the information released as to, I've talked to dozens of birth mothers, both in Illinois and Pennsylvania, and that's simply not the case. Most of the birth mothers are, stay out of attempts to find the children they relinquished for adoption for the children's sake. But I don't think it's very realistic to think that anyone gives a child up for adoption and just forgets about it and just walks away. So my thought is, if I should ever meet my birth mother, if I should find her name and be able to somehow, make a connection with her, I think it's really between she and I to determine as adults what kind of relationship we do want to have, if any, and how to proceed from there. I really don't think it's the government's role to determine what our relationship should be.
Well, and as we said, for all you know, you may have siblings.
I know nothing about the circumstances of my birth. I don't know what her situation was. Interestingly, Pennsylvania does provide for an adoption agency to provide adoptees with a summary of what's in their adoption files. So I obtained that about 15 years ago, and it's very intriguing. I have absolutely no information about my birth or my identity, but I do have this 2-page document that someone pulled together out of files. So obviously I pore over it. I know every detail. It contains information about my birth mother's height and weight as she reported it, her ethnic background as she reported it, again, but just as someone, a caseworker, transcribed that information years and years ago, so I can't be sure about the accuracy of any of it. So it's really just, there's a basic need to know, and I think psychologists recognize that today, and that's why adopted children today are treated very differently. Some people actually have open adoptions where they have the children they've adopted have relationships with their birth parents. Whether or not that's a good idea really has nothing to do with this bill. This bill only impacts adult adoptees. But I think there's a basic recognition that it's important to your emotional well-being and to have a sense of your identity, and that's what we're looking for here.
Before we close out, when you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I think all of us sit there, we all bring our own different life experiences. Does being an adoptive person change any way that you relate to any legislation when you're sitting on various committees? Has there ever been an issue that really wasn't about the issue of adoption rights, but somehow made you reflect on that issue in any different way?
Well, I was adopted at birth to an amazing family. My mom and dad will always be my mom and dad, regardless of whether I get a document that identifies my biological parents or not. So I have always identified myself as an adopted person. So I'm sure that has impacted me throughout the years. But it's something for me. I do strongly believe in adoption. So I serve on the Adoption Reform Committee, and any issue that pertains to adoption I pay close attention to because I am such a strong believer. Adoption has given me the most wonderful family I could ever dream of. A great sibling, my brother, nephews, and a niece, and I've been very, very lucky. And if I'm ever to meet my birth mother, I think the first thing I would say is thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to have such a wonderful family.
All right, well, Representative Ann Williams, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Terry.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.